So good afternoon. After a summer break, we are back with the Explorers. I hope everybody had a good summer. And we start our new year for the Explorers with a very special friend and guest of mine, Margaret Koch. Margaret agreed very generously to do this presentation today. So before introducing you to Margaret, I will let you know that this event is being recorded. It's going to be uploaded to the Vimeo channel of the Federation. And if you want a copy, you can email me and I will send it to you. Also in the chat, you can see the URL of the Vimeo channel of the Federation. So there you can see all the videos we have recorded before Margaret, in case you're interested. So I'm going to tell you about Margaret. Margaret Koch is director of the Bullock Museum in Austin, Texas. In that role, Margaret directs the work of a dedicated staff of 90 professionals under the auspices of the State Preservation Board. Margaret brings to the museum over 30 years of professional knowledge and strategic planning, experience in management, curation, exhibit design, conservation, and research. She leads the museum's efforts in the development of creative and compelling programming, including exhibitions that attract and engage visitors from across the world. Her responsibilities include oversight and vision of all aspects of the museum's mission to share the story of Texas through meaningful educational experiences, including field trips, special exhibitions and projects, teacher enrichment programs, films, presentations, and concerts for over 4,100 visitors. I'm not sure if I'm saying the number right, annually in a non-pandemic year. She has particular interest in raising up and supporting emerging leaders in the field and increasing an understanding of relevancy of history to inform our future existence. Prior to joining the Bullock Museum in 2013, Margaret led the exhibition and research team at the Missouri History Museum located in St. Louis. Margaret earned a Master of Fine Arts in the Museum Exhibition Planning and Design from the University of Arts in Philadelphia and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Religion from Carroll University in Waukesha. I'm sorry, the state, I don't know what's that.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, I'm sorry. She presents regularly at local national events and conferences and serves on the Council of the Texas Association of Museums. Margaret also worked for over 7 years as Director of International Students and Families at a graduate theological school in Chicago and has maintained many friendships with former students now in service around the world. Margaret, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amina. And it's so lovely to continue this connection with you. I know we first met when you were a student at UT and you became a research fellow for us here at the museum, and we're so integral to helping us get insight into different archives for particular projects. So it's a pleasure to be here with the Explorers today, and I look forward to the conversation. Hello, everyone. And Amina has explained to me that one of the things that's really been beneficial about this format is the opportunity to enter into discussion and have informal conversation and answer questions. So my presentation, as it were, today is really to give you all background about the museum, about our stakeholders and our reason for existence, as well as to talk a bit about the field as a whole and the role that museums are finding themselves in a position, an opportunity to develop better their relevance and their interaction with the communities in which they serve. That's been an ongoing process for several decades, but I think the pandemic and certain attacks on understanding of history from a much broader and scholarly as well as meaningful method has just moved us more to the forefront. And I think part of what I want to impart today is the really vital and critical role that museums can have in helping their communities move forward. And there are some wonderful examples around the country of that happening. So a little bit, Amina has been very gracious to talk a bit about me, a bit about the Bullock Museum. So our official title in the register is the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum. What does that mean? We are part of a modest-sized state agency called the State Preservation Board that is responsible for the Capitol Complex, the State Cemetery, the Governor's Mansion, the Bullock Museum. And so we are very much, unlike many other state agencies, we are very much devoted to Austin, Texas, to Central Texas. But as the State History Museum, we also have to look outside of our immediate area and how we serve Texas as a whole. And if you haven't been to Texas in a car and having had to drive across it, you don't really have a sense of how enormous the state really is and how diverse it is, both in environment, geography, political leanings, cultures that are represented. Texas has always been an incredibly diverse state, even before it was a state. And so there are certain challenges that come with serving a population that is that impressive and that diverse, and where there's so many miles to get across as well. So we are one of the youngest state history museums in the country. We were brought into existence by an act of the Texas legislature in the late 90s and opened our doors to the public in 2001. And the catalyst behind all of that was the individual for whom we are named. At the time of our inception, he was Lieutenant Governor, and that's Bob Bullock. He was a politician of enormous stature within the state, and actually on quite a national level, an international level as well. He had a dream as he was Lieutenant Governor and traveled around the country that Texas needed a state museum that was worthy of the area that he called home. And so his impetus for being able to get that creation of a state museum through the legislature in the way that he did was another discovery off the coast of Texas, an area called Matagorda Bay. And that was a discovery by one of our sister agencies, the Texas Historical Commission, particularly their Marine Archaeology Division, in finding once more and bringing back to the surface a 300-year-old ship called La Belle, which originally sailed from France in 1684. And it was part of an expedition that was formed by King Louis XIV and an explorer called La Salle, who had been successful up and down the Mississippi and had this vision for creating a new community at the mouth of the Mississippi. If he had been successful, the founding of New Orleans would have gone back several decades, but unfortunately he was not successful, overshot his mark, and ended up off the coast of Matagorda Bay. And that story is for another session. But with the discovery of that ship, that was the impetus for the Lieutenant Governor to say, we need a state museum. I wanted to be able to share this ever-changing story with every new research opportunity of this incredible state that we live in very educational and meaningful way. Education was a big part of his political career. Getting funding for it, diversifying his cabinet, all of that was very important. So that discovery and needing a home for that ship became one of the reasons that he was able to bring us into existence. So right from the beginning, we not only had a responsibility to the taxpayers of Texas, but also to the legislature. But it was all in service to the public. We are not an artifact collecting institution. We are built on relationships. So every object that is on the floor of our exhibitions at any given minute of any given day is here by the grace and confidence in us from another institution or private lender. So that means, just like our mission, this ever-changing story of Texas, our long-term history galleries, kind of the core galleries of Texas history and culture and science and events and people, there are artifacts coming in and out of there every day. They're not static. So there are particular changes or particular challenges in that as well. We have a staff that has been somewhat reduced due to the pandemic as people reassess where their careers and their families and they need to be. So we're right now about 65 people spread across multiple departments. And we are currently in the midst of a strategic planning process where we hope to map out at the end of that process the goals and ambitions and critical areas for us to work on for the public for the next 3 to 5 years. And that will take us up to our 25th anniversary in 2026, which if you've been paying attention to American Association for State and Local History and other federal programs, you'll also know that that is the anniversary of the 250th founding of the United States. And so our anniversary year is going to be tied up in some ways with the commemoration of that event in US history. And that'll be challenging for us because we know what an important role Texas and the West played in the American Revolution and what led up to it and what followed, but many people across the country are not even aware. They always think of the 13 colonies for that. So we've got some challenges ahead of us in terms of helping people be aware of the importance of that event for Texans and Texans' role in that founding series of events for the country as well. So when we opened in 2001, we opened to great fanfare, and we opened with the tagline that is, you'll see it on our URL on the website. If you visit us, you will see it engraved in stone and concrete around the building. You will see it in our grand lobby as you enter. There's this beautiful terrazzo floor with a mosaic that has, if you look down on it from above, campfire with a diversity of people around it, and that whole idea of sharing our history and culture through stories from different voices and multiplicity of ethnicities that were crucial to Texas's founding and coming into existence. There is that, it's not just something we say, but it's actually ingrained in the architecture and structure of the museum. And so part of our stewardship, I will call it, of those stories is really quite dynamic, because I have worked in other museums of wonderful, outstanding credentials and collections and people, and had that privilege and had that honor. And oftentimes in those museums that have collections, their focus of what they exhibit and what they program around is understandably tied to what they hold in their storerooms and what their curators wish to bring out to the public. For us, it's a little bit different. When you are built on relationships and you don't own your own dimensional artifacts or documents, paintings, all of that. It challenges you to think in new ways about the narratives, the historical narratives that are important to the public, important to modern times, as well as historic understanding, and find ways, do your research around the country and find ways to bring those artifacts, that material cultural proof, into the museum and be able to share that story, share that history with a general public. When we were redoing our first floor gallery, starting the process back in 2011, it was before my time in steering this incredible institution, but at the time they did some focus groups, surveys, and what they found was that among the visitors that were coming through the museum, there was a huge understanding, or a significant understanding, of Texas after 1836, or from 1836 on forward. For anybody familiar with Texas history, 1836 was the Texas Revolution, where Texas seceded from Mexico. So there was strong understanding that way. But for more than 16,000 years of inhabited history of Texas, there was lesser understanding of all of the history, human history, that came before 1836. So that became an issue in planning for us and for our exhibit development team of how do we address that fact that so many people are coming in with no knowledge of human habitation in the land we call Texas before that time period. So that was one of the first ways in which we utilized information we received from our visitors about what they currently knew, to instruct us in terms of what starting point we were going to have to develop on the floor, for them to really fully understand our history. And for those of us in the Bullock Museum, we want to be the starting point for discovery and exploration of Texas history, building knowledge. We don't have all the answers, we're not the be all and end all, but we are a great first stop for increasing knowledge. And Austin is one of the fastest growing communities in the United States at this point in time. And so there are people moving here who have not ever had the Texas experience. And if you've been here for a bit, you can see that there is definitely a Texas ethos, which, contrary to what might be seen quite frequently in news media outlets, is actually on an individual basis a very warm and hospitable approach to people. And I've experienced that on a personal level. My accent, as you can tell, is not Texan. I grew up in Wisconsin and I've worked around the country. And Texas, like, you know, as complicated as it is in terms of all the different approaches to both history and modern day interpretation of that history, is still home and worth investing in. And that we have to, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in terms of our structure, we have to be cognizant of here in developing our programs and keeping ourselves relevant to community, we have to be cognizant of what that all means. So if I pose to you the question or the statement, we welcome everybody, we are welcoming to all, stop for a minute and think to yourself, who is that all? What do we mean by all? Well, that's going to mean the people that have been marginalized up to this point, or felt marginalized, or are unseen, even though they've played a critical role in the development of the state. But it's also going to mean those people who have been vocal and who are coming from a different landscape, a different approach, who have a passionate connection to history that may be history that was passed down to them. And so it's intertwined with memory, and it's intertwined with how they see their identity. And they may feel threatened by challenges to that, as there is greater scholarly research on topics and more information comes to light. So somehow, as we work as a state museum, we have to find every way, we have to use every tool possible in our toolbox to be as bipartisan, as scholarly, as honest, and as accurate as possible, and present the history and the culture as it is, utilizing those historical documents, those primary sources, that material, tangible culture of artifact, in order to be able to say, okay, I understand what your great-grandmother told you. Here are the things that make that history even more rich, that are coming from different perspectives. Take a look at that and draw your own conclusions. Because when you worked in a museum and you studied visitors, you see that every visitor coming through the door is coming in with their own biases, with sometimes misperceptions, sometimes incredible knowledge that is very much grounded in scholarship. But oftentimes there are those who are visiting communities where maybe the schools were underfunded, or maybe they've only got part of the story. And I'm not aware of any of my colleagues, friends, or family who I've ever been able to share a new, enhanced version of history and have them accept it, even if it goes contrary to what they originally believed, by hitting them over the head with it. It's more a, here's the carrot. Look, here is the common denominator. This is part of the richness of your history. And here are these other perspectives that we are sharing with you that are grounded in academic research, that are grounded in primary sources. And take a look at those and see if that broadens your perspective, broadens your scope a lot. So we are constantly and sometimes it feels like this for the team, walking that tightrope of one, understanding our audiences and our communities and what they're open to receiving, what they can take, having multiple types of experiences in the galleries and in our programs, so that we're reaching people who connect to things in different ways. Some may connect through music, some may connect through art, some may connect through seeing something that they know their mother had in their kitchen, and find those ins to a conversation that will expand the way in which they thought about their history, they thought about Texas before, and build on it, and provide the initiative for them to take that and grow from it. So, you know, it as museums look at approaches for doing this, many museums will, particularly those who have smaller communities around them, or tighter knit communities around them than an entire state like Texas, will make those connections with community groups, will invite them in, not just as audience, but as actual planners, as actual collaborators in displaying the history, in displaying culture, science, and creating programs that help that community grow. I will give you one example of something that we are currently going to be working on for this coming year. Before the pandemic, we signed a contract to bring in an exhibition from the Minnesota Science Center called Mental Health Mind Matters. Now, what you might say, does that have to do with a history museum, and a history museum that's focused on Texas? Well, if you look at the statistics from the Texas Department of Health and Human Services, there is an enormous number of people living in Texas, multi-generational Texans and new Texans alike, who are suffering from some sort of mental illness, which might be debilitating, might be unseen, might be just on the fringes, but it is something that they are dealing with on a daily basis. So this exhibition is really designed to dispel the myths around mental illness and open up a conversation. So it's a very beautifully interactive, meaning lots of things to do and test out to help you understand different types of mental illness. And our programming, we're looking at partnering with the St. David's Foundation, which has healthy communities at its core, potentially with medical centers in the area, so that we can both internally help our staff who, are not alone in suffering through the stress of a pandemic, and help them through that, who have suffered, as many parts of the country have this season, with past hurricanes and natural disasters, with loss of family and friends, as well as biological illnesses. And so we're hoping to be able to utilize our platform to talk to help the community talk in a way about this, dispel myths, learn from it, and actually, in a way, connect them to services. We also, this past year, had on the floor an exhibition that we did, modest-sized, that laid the groundwork for understanding human trafficking, both labor and sexual trafficking. And that is an exhibition that we are currently preparing to go on the road around the state of Texas. And at no charge, we've gotten funding to be able to cover the shipping, and we're translating it into a panel exhibition, because one of the things that our legislature has done in the last couple of sessions is actually make it mandatory for schools and school districts to talk about human trafficking as part of their curriculum. But what that legislation didn't do is identify the sources and the ways in which to talk about it. So we worked with survivors and multiple private and public agencies from around the country to develop this exhibition, and to do it in such a way that answers the basic questions about human trafficking. So there's a basis of understanding. So we're hoping that this will be an exhibition that teachers and libraries and community centers will be able to use as a starting point for meeting those requirements of the legislature. So those are just two examples of the way in which we have broken through what might have been parameters and boundaries of explaining what Texas history is, in order to create exhibitions and programming related to them that speak to Texans and issues that are important to them, and also serve needs that we're identifying within the state. And at the same time, you can see 16,000 years of Texas history in the galleries. So I think I'll end there. And Hamina, you know us well, having been a part of our team, even for a short time. But I'm wondering if there in that description, if there are questions that you have or that you think audiences listening to the recorded session might be wondering about, and I'll try to do my best to answer them.
Yes, actually, I have many questions, and also and also some comments. I had a question related to the human trafficking exhibition that you mentioned, but you already answered. And so that question leads me to another comment I had with the mental illness initiative that you are preparing for next year. And I think these are the kinds of initiatives that are very valuable to be as part as a museum, and also to tell audience, to make the public understand that history is also that history is not only a ship, like you mentioned before, La Belle, but it's also these things that are happening right now and that are very close to us. And I see now how the community can find relevance and engagement in that. I was going to ask you, do you have any kind of study or statistics about how people reacted, for example, to the human trafficking exhibit? What did they thought about that?
Yes, so it generated some publicity, including on several of the news stations. We did several interviews related to it. And we didn't do, just because of pandemic and staff time, we didn't follow up with any kind of formal survey while the exhibit was on the floor. So what I have at this point is anecdotal from what I witnessed. And that included, our numbers were down. Normally, during that time frame, we would see about 40,000 people come through the exhibit, but we were considerably down because of the pandemic,
Yeah.
and so the numbers were certainly less than that. But we have a significant number of families that come through, and audiences that are over the age of 55. In a non-pandemic year, we would have, in normal year, we would have about 85,000 school kids come through during that, that time. So what I was seeing personally was incredible interest. And I saw this two ways. One, while I was down on the floor, and also I have the advantage from my office of seeing the gallery from up here. So I could, as I was pausing between meetings and things, I could see who was in the gallery and what they were stopping reading. And what we were seeing was there was a high level, and we were very careful about how much information we put out on the floor. And we kept to, if I didn't know anything about this, or I had preconceived notions about what human trafficking was, and it was somebody else's problem and there wasn't anything I could do about it, I was just going to be sad about it, what are the questions that would have in my mind? So it was, what is human trafficking? What role does social media play a part? What can I do? Were some of the basic questions that we asked. And we had 3 videos in there, and they were the voices of survivors who, in very calming and very straightforward ways, talked through their experience about what it meant and how they came through the other side in that journey. And those really resonated. And you can see those on our website if anybody is interested. Because if you look under past exhibits, you'll see all the exhibits that are no longer live on the floor, but they live in some way on our website. But when I would see, I actually had a conversation with a young mother, Latinx heritage, whose sister was visiting in town, and they caught us in the gallery when we were doing an interview about it and stopped to talk. And the mother, who had quite young kids, said, "This is so important for us to learn about. This is so critical for us to understand." And her sister, who was younger than she was, I put her in her early 20s, I watched her, and for a 6,000 square foot exhibit, I know from museum studies, people spend only about 20 minutes in that gallery, right? So they're not reading everything. Our exhibition was around the range of about 1,000 to 1,200 square feet. So it was approachable, it was digestible, kept to the basics. What do people need to know in order to begin thinking differently about responsibility for caring for survivors and trying to eradicate a evil of society. And to have somebody spend 20 minutes in that amount of space, reading everything, watching each of the videos, looking at the artifacts that are connected to the stories, was really powerful. And that's exactly what happened in that case. And right now we have another traveling exhibition from the New York Historical Society called Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow. And that'll be closing here at the museum in another month or so. Actually, no, it goes through beginning of December. And the diversity of people that are coming through that gallery and the time, it's also where I can see them. They can see me too, where the amount of time that they're spending going through there, you see these conversations start happening and this pointing to images and artifacts, and that intergenerational experience is probably the best indicator I have that whatever they might believe about what's being presented to them, because I'm not in a position to be able to eavesdrop on them, there is conversation happening. There is an engagement with the topic. And we know that what we have on the floor is accurate. So they're engaging, talking with each other, asking each other different questions, pausing, reflecting, and if I could see inside their heads, I would say the wheels are turning. They're thinking about this, and so we know that one of our main goals, one of our core values of engagement, is actually happening. And the fact that we have a diversity of voices on the floor, which is another one of our core values, it tells me while we still have a long way to go in many respects, we are on the right track. That felt like a long answer to your question.
No. I think it was pretty interesting because it got me thinking about like the effective ways to reach audiences and different kinds of public. And you mentioned that for example, the human trafficking exhibition was very basic. And I think that was very brilliant actually, because I would thought maybe that if you give more information and give like more testimonies or things like that, people would be like more interested. But I think in this case, to create an awareness for all kinds of people, like you were mentioning, Museum for All being very basic with those questions was pretty effective. So sometimes, as I learned also in graduate school, less is more. Mm-hmm. It's like about the way you engage that was really, really interesting for me, because sometimes perhaps as a scholar, I think, okay, these people need to know all the information about the topic to be able to understand it, and perhaps you don't.
Right. And right. And what we're hoping to do is, we know there is no way Texas history, any state's history, is so incredibly rich and complex. There is no way in 44,000 square feet we are going to be able to tell that entire history, even a tiny fragment of it, right? But so our approach is, what do we need to share with people in order to get them interested? And then they leave, or they head to our gift shop, or they go home and they're like, gosh, what was that thing I saw in the gallery? I need to delve into it more, right? So they're taking ownership of discovery. They're taking ownership of trying to find out more. And when we're very, very fortunate, they'll make a return visit. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we're changing artifacts in our core galleries all the time. So, there's a new discovery in our archive. If we can get the lender to lend it to us, we can share that with people for the first time. And we can add to the research and make it more accessible to people who are coming to see it for real. So yeah, the exhibition component and the programming component of it is based on all that scholarly research. And it's very critical for us to be accurate, especially in this day and age of misinformation, right? And being pulled out of context and quoted out of context and that sort of thing. So that's really critical for us. But the way in which we put it on the walls and we put it in interactives and digital media has to appeal and grab hold of the imagination of a really diverse audience. And not everything's going to do that. We have to be okay with that. There's another factor here that's really important for us. We are in the process of going completely bilingual, Spanish and English in the entire museum. If anybody's been involved in graphic design and you've tried to put side by side English and Spanish, and you don't have word limits on it, and you need to, got curators, wonderful curators who've done such a huge amount of research, your whole wall will be taken up and trying to describe one artifact. And there isn't the space, there isn't the physical space to be able to do that. So that actually, going bilingual has actually helped us hone. We actually do have word limits on labels and things, hone how many words can be there. So it means we have to be, when I say basic, I think in some respects, a better word is concise.
Yes.
We have to whittle it down to its essence, its most critical essence for understanding, or at least having that beginning of understanding. And sometimes a different format will help with this. Sometimes it will be a multimedia experience, but we don't start from the perspective of, man, what's the most incredible new innovative digital experience that's out there, and then plan for that. What we look at is, what do we want people to think, feel, connect with? And then what is the best way to help them do that? And then that helps us choose our medium.
Yes, Margaret, along those same lines, I was thinking about the mental illness exhibition you are putting together. Would it have like the same basic structure, like being like concise, as you said, or how are you dealing? Because I know sometimes people that have some kind of mental illness are they don't want to talk about it. It's something that it's shameful. You don't want people to know. So how are you addressing that in the exhibition?
That's a really important piece. I mean, with any topic, whether it's strictly historical or brings in the science, like Mind Matters does, for example, is not to re-victimize, not to either your visitors or the people who have contributed. And that takes a great deal of sensitivity and a great deal of listening to the people that you're bringing in to help you create the exhibition. And the worst thing you can do with that is create something like that without involving the people that know the subject well, but also are affected by it, right? And are working and healing, and finding reputable people in your community to work with is really critical. And so that was critical, not re-victimizing survivors when they were being so generous to share their story with us. And be public with it. We were fortunate they're already public with their story and working in the field. So that was a huge help. We, with Mind Matters, will be working with reputable health professionals that will help us navigate that. And the exhibition Mind Matters was designed to be multi-aged, and also find ways to explore different conditions and how people may see the world through their illness, so that if you haven't thought you're experiencing something, or you don't know, or you have a family member, you want to understand them better, there are ways in which you can do that. That doesn't mean you have to drag the family member along with you in order to subject them to this. But the whole exhibition is designed to reduce the stigma around mental illness and make it more normal to talk about. People are afraid to talk about it. They don't want to be judged. They don't want to be seen as different. They are private, don't want their struggles in the public sphere, right? So that is something that, as we're planning for audiences, our main reason for being is to understand that and be respectful of that. And if we find, as the exhibition goes on, that there is something that we didn't do well, or we could have done better, and we have the means, we adjust it during the run of the exhibition. We had, this is a bit different, but thinking back to the historical narrative, we have a number of sections in the galleries, in our core galleries, that we want to update. And we've got a production schedule for doing that over time, because you can't do everything at once. Amazing, right? But we are planning to do that. Well, a couple of years back, a teacher reached out to us, taking very significant issue with one of the sections that was on our list to redo. And it was about the way in which we talked about the Mexican-American War. And so we looked at that. She was working with her students and trying to get them to understand, advocating for a more balanced understanding of history and presentation within the gallery. So we looked at it, we're like, she is absolutely right. She's saying things that we wanted to work on. These are important for her students, and her curriculum development. We're going to bump this up the priority list. So she sent that to us, I think, in the spring of the year after they'd done their field trip. We worked on it over the summer, and the next school year we had redeveloped much more comprehensive approach, coming from different viewpoints about the Mexican-American War and Texas role in it. So that's a way in which we, whenever possible, try to be as responsive to our audience as we can be. Now, that doesn't mean that we're still not walking a tightrope at times with traditional ways of looking at history, and the way Texas history in particular. We have to navigate those, and sometimes we're ready to tackle them, and sometimes we need to do more groundwork at the back end in order to do that work. So, but most of the time we are much more successful. We don't have that kind of interference in that, and we're able to really navigate those waters, I think, fairly well.
I think those initiatives are so interesting and so important, and also so timely. And also along the community engagement, Margaret, I know that the museum not only does exhibitions, it does like festivals, like the Native American Festival. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's like a community engagement, but in a different way. They go there and they perform dances, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, our fall American Indian Heritage Day is coming up in a week's time, and we work with a local group, have for a number of years now, called Great Promise for American Indians. They actually were also integral into helping us redevelop our first floor exhibition that talks about where the story of Texas began with the early American Indian inhabitants. So members of their group were part of that advisory group and connected us to tribes throughout the country to help get that story accurate. And so Great Promise has an incredible cadre of drummers and dancers, and they will do several performances in the museum lobby, and we will be live streaming and taping that, so it'll be available, I think, on our Facebook page. And we, part of what they do too is we have a number of schools. We'll have about 250 children here for each of those performances with their teachers. And part of it is a learning opportunity, because unfortunately, even after all the work we've done in more recent decades, there's still a lot of people who don't understand that American Indian tribal organizations are alive and well and thriving and trying to preserve their culture and continuing to develop and bridge multiple worlds, right? While refinding, reclaiming, taking back their history under their ownership. So this is a way in which Great Promise for American Indians, which represents a number of tribes that are here in Austin, can steward their own story, and help educate and help kids understand that the cultures didn't disappear, that the people in the room are alive and well and continuing that story of their history. And that is something that is really critical. And that's one of the more, all of our relationships are important, but that's one of the most important ones that we have, I think, in because there's so much misperception out there about Texas's early inhabitants and the legacy that they've left and who they are today. Yeah.
Yes, yes. In terms of community engagement, I also think that that kind of activities also attract more people because they are fun. They are fun.
Yeah.
People don't have to read.
Yeah.
They don't have to go through galleries. They can also, I don't know, they can perhaps participate in some way and see some people for performing dances. So I think that's also like a very nice strategy that some museums are doing right now also to keep people interested. And that leads me to my other question. It's very interesting for me that I knew that, but then you reminded me that this museum doesn't have like a permanent collection.
Mhm.
You have objects that come in and out all the time. So that must also have a big component for community engagement, right? Because you have
It
to work
does,
closely
yeah.
with the community to decide which objects go and which ones don't go.
It does have that opportunity. Pandemic had a huge effect on that because as the number of museums closed, our lenders were no longer lending. So we had more open cases because we had to be respectful of the loan period for things we did have on exhibit. So as we took them off, to respect lending agreements that we had, museums weren't in a place where they could lend new things to us. So we're just, as museums have reopened and started their lending policies again, we're just at a place now where we're beginning to fill some of those cases that were empty during that time. But yes, there is that opportunity. And I will say one of the things we need to be very careful about as a museum is provenance and respect. And I want to tie that back to what you were asking about with American Indian Heritage Day, right? So I mentioned we have a longstanding relationship with Great Promise. That took years to develop, and it took a lot of trust on their part as well as our part. But a lot on their part. We had to be trustworthy to steward their story, to be a place where they could discuss openly and honestly the pain, the suffering, the legacy that they endured, the resilience, and where they're headed for the future. And so that relationship carries over into other things. And with American Indian objects, we've actually built it into our collections policy to be very careful about where we borrow from in terms of any kind of sacred objects or anything that's tied with a culture that has been abused, and make sure also that we are also built into our collections policy is a practice of having the blessing from the tribe in order to put those items on display, and a physical blessing of staff and the objects when they come into the building and before they go on display, and then typically again when they come off. And that blessing is out of respect for an acknowledgement of the ancestry of and the makers of those objects, the life cycle that they may have gone through, and the acknowledgement that their importance goes beyond the physical, particularly for the tribes from which they're come, and enters the spiritual. And that might seem a bit esoteric, but it's a really critical piece of us being able to be ethical about the great gift we've been presented with, to be able to display something that is not ours.
Yes, I mean, I asked you that because I am, as you know, I study Colombian museums, and there's one particular Colombian museums that it's not a museum exactly, it's like a hall, an exhibition hall, and the creators always tell me this is not a museum. Museums are places where things go to die. They become static. This is a very small place, very rural, marginal, and then they opened a natural history museum, and they showed me very proudly that that was a museum because it was full of stuffed dead animals. So I think that that difference is like really telling and really interesting. And then I think about the Bullock Museum. It's like the perfect example of how a museum is a place where things don't go to die because they don't remain there. It's a place where people can do performances and when things also come to life. But it's also like kind of the context and the mindset of like the creators and the conventional tradition of what's a museum. So I think the Bullock Museum is doing like a tremendous work along those lines, also trying to show people like come here, have a good time, engage and learn things. And even though we are based on scholarly research, it's open for all. I think that's like the most important thing. Like it's a museum for all.
Well, you are very kind, Amina. We are definitely a work in progress, and we're on the road to becoming stronger and better with regards to that. So there's still much for us to learn, and we have to continue building on these relationships. I'll give you two other examples that are actually from a number of years ago from other museums. So when I was doing my master's degree at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, I reached out to different museums to find out how they were interacting with their communities and with the spiritualness of objects. And at the time I talked with the exhibition head at the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. And they either had just finished or were working on an exhibition that, and they're very visitor centric, but this exhibition that they were working on was about the use of the islands as bomb deployment testing. Right, so using the waters off the islands, it was beautiful paradise that everybody talks about for military testing, which you can imagine had damaging effects on ecosystem as well, right? But beyond that, it was also for Native Hawaiians in many respects an affront to the ancestry of the islands, the physical presence of the ancestors for the islands. And so this exhibition is so beautifully thought out and worked on with the Native American or Hawaiian elders. Its main purpose, its mission statement, was to ask forgiveness from the ancestors for the bombings, for the deployment and the testing of these bombs. I mean, how powerful. For them, people came to see it, but that wasn't the main goal. The main goal was a much higher spiritual goal of recognizing, marketing this, and talking about this is the purpose of this exhibition. The other example I will give you, and I believe it is actually the State Museum of Alaska, which, as you can imagine, has a huge collection of Native Alaskan artifacts within it, and a mission to help preserve and tell of the culture in Alaska. They actually, if I'm not mistaken, have a agreement with elders in the community that artifacts may be checked out, that the institution acknowledges they are stewards and caretakers of the objects, not owners, and that the objects that are important to ritual can be checked out for the tribes for potlatches and other community events. I mean, it's this, and that's a relationship that takes time to build, because again, I think it was Stephen Covey. I've got a note on my computer, different quotes that inspire me throughout the day. I think it was author Stephen Covey who said, "Progress moves at the speed of trust." And that's true. So, you know, if you don't have that trust, you're not going to make your progress. So you have to take the time to build up that trust, to be trustworthy, to listen well, and build those relationships that are going to make you more integral to the community. And so if you're suffering a loss as an institution of funding or whatever, the community can also rally around and say, "You're important to us. We want to see that you succeed." So, you know, there is that benefit back to the institution that's reciprocal, that is important, particularly in these times, to remember as well.
Yes, I think those examples are amazing. They're very moving. They're very touching. The first one you mentioned was really, really, as you mentioned, powerful. And I think it also fulfills like the mission of a museum, like should help community. I mean, a museum not only is there to show things, it's also has to be a part of people's lives. And that's sometimes not so easy to do
Yeah.
because of like,
Yeah. Exactly. And you know, the whole museum community isn't there yet. A few years ago, the International Committee of Museums, which is part of the American Alliance of Museums, tried to put a new definition on what a museum was. You remember that? It went,
yes, yeah,
I mean, there was so much controversy and dissent over what they were proposing. So they're regrouping, and they're going to try it again. But in my mind, the relationship between the scholarly, which is critical for having an as accurate a picture as any of us can at this point in time with what's available to us, and how that gets disseminated and engaged as a community. They're not they're too interconnected to be separated out. They need each other. And you and I have talked about, you know, the importance of public history and how that has been changing things as well, right? The days of us, I think, being able to have our head down and solely devote ourselves to the research alone, which might be transformative, right? New researchers, wonderful researchers are coming up all the time that are looking at documents in different ways and putting together threads across documents that we never knew existed before, right? And that is really critical work. That next phase is, how do we tell people about it? How do we get them excited about that? How do we get them to think, oh my gosh, this changes how my family came to be, or this adds to the journey for me. I can learn about this and it can have impact for how I'm going to be in my community next, beyond. And so that carries that that really admirable and wonderful event of new research, new identity, new concepts to the general public who really need that stronger understanding and that dispelling of fear. If there's something new out there, it adds to my identity. It doesn't disallow it. It doesn't um, it doesn't have to eat it up or subsume it, right?
Yeah.
It adds to who I am. And that is something to celebrate and not condemn. That's a long road for us to climb right now, I fear, because it's much easier to build fear than it is to build that kind of feeling, that of who you are and everything. And it takes time for people to be able to do that. So I'll just leave that there, because I think that's one of our biggest challenges ahead.
Well,
And yeah.
I mean, I know it's a big challenge, but I think all the projects you are doing, the exhibitions are like leading that way, just for
I
the
hope so.
topics you are tackling with and stuff that are very, very controversial and can be very hard to show and present, like the mental illness and the human trafficking, which brings me to another question. This is a question just like a personal uh, curiosity I have. When you deal with aspects, for example, like human trafficking, of course, you show the testimonies of the survivors and you talk with them, but do you also talk with the perpetrators or who actually committed the crime?
We did not in this case, although one of the artifacts that was highlighted in the exhibition was from a perpetrator.
Okay.
But in this case, we did not do that. This was a first foray for us. And when we first started working on this exhibition, it was actually inspired by the governor of Texas initiative to increase understanding of human trafficking throughout the state. And he had produced a video on that. And as I watched that, I'm like, how can we use our educational platform to amplify this message? Because we have so many schools and we have so many people that see it as happening outside of their communities, and it's happening, next door, unfortunately. And how to be aware without policing, but how to care about it in some ways was the result of that. So we initially had been thinking about, we could tie this into a history of human trafficking and all that sort of thing. And what we whittled it down to again was the concise starting point for it. And, we talk about enslavement, we talk about discrimination in other parts of our core galleries. But this, we wanted, because of our space size, because of, at the time, we didn't know what it was going to look like. We wanted to listen closely to our advisors before we made any premeditated guesses about what it was going to look like. And so the exhibition came out of what was important for them, for people to understand. And maybe down the line, there's another opportunity to bring in those other voices. It was not a choice, an intentional choice that we made this time around. But you hit on something that's really important. When you're creating an exhibition, creating a program, there are several things you have to look at. You need that mission statement that keeps you on track, right? And every choice you make has to be intentional. When we did an exhibition a few years back called Life and Death on the Border, which looked at state-sanctioned violence by Texas Rangers against people of Mexican-American descent who were American and Texas citizens in the early 19th century, we made a conscientious choice that this was not going to be a memorial of those, to those victims and to the events, but it was going to use the artifacts to tell people what happened and stick to that artifact story and share the complexity of that. So it acknowledged that the violence happened, and it looked at what happened after that violence, but it was It was intentionally not a memorialization. That might be something that another museum would choose to do and perfectly legitimate. It was not something that that we did at the time. And I think for that reason, the exhibition was very well received. There was very little criticism. It was mostly herald in the press. And so being prepared for the worst that can happen and being sure that, yeah, okay, we can handle that, you know, if we move forward, or under what circumstances do you change direction? And so those are the kinds of questions you have to ask in planning, and to be honest with yourself about it.
Yeah, I think that's also very important when thinking about a museum. It's also very important to be aware that every exhibition is a decision. You cannot put everything, you cannot include everything, you cannot take into account every single voice. So those choices, I think, are also very, very important, that I would also make aware people that are starting in the world of museums, like be very aware of that. There's a complaint I hear again in my country for some marginal voices that say, oh, but they don't take us into account. Probably it's true, but I also understand that at some point you have to just make decisions. So it's hard. It's hard for a museum to be like all, but also, yeah, I understand that, and I think it's very interesting. And I would like to just to finish. Would you consider your museum, the Bullock Museum, to be like a facilitator, like a more than a conventional museum, more like a community-centered space?
I can see that. I've been doing more reading lately. Actually, a book by Priya Parker called The Art of Gathering, and it's a wonderful starting point for meetings, for getting together, for thinking about this conversation today. But you know, it kind of reminds me of the process for creating exhibition and programming. Is why are you doing it? Why does it matter? You know, this so what to it. So we do this great thing. So what happens next? What do we want to have come from it? So what I hope we will become is a place for gathering where conversations can be started, facilitated, um, respectfully, kindly, gracefully, and be as much as possible a safer place in which to have those conversations, even if the topic itself is challenging and maybe doesn't feel safe, right? So it takes skill building to do that. And one of the things we're doing internally right now with funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services is creating a leadership empowerment process for our department heads and our intermediate staff members, so that they can gain leadership skills and be able to mirror those qualities throughout the museum to staff across the board. So we still are a work in progress. I mean, we're still developing. We're still, you know, times we flounder, but we are making headway, and we've got a really rich legacy to build on to continue that facilitation, I guess, to continue that gathering.
Yes, I think you're an inspiration, Margaret. Really, I have admired your work from forever. And you just said something that really touched me very deeply, like the museum needs to be a safe place. I think you that's very appropriate, very timely, very important. I just want to thank you for accepting this invitation. It was really interesting. It was lovely. It was very also eye-opening. Sometimes when you study things so much and you don't see other perspectives, you can't see like the complexity and the richness of your own field. So
Guilty.
thank you very much. So is there anything you would like to add or to tell our audience that will hear this recording?
Well, I just appreciate so much the invitation. It was an honor to record the session with you. And I would just encourage everyone to not lose hope, to examine the whys of what you're doing and how you're doing it, who you're doing it with, and then most importantly, who you're doing it for, and have courage and um, keep moving forward. We're going to make mistakes. Goodness, we're human, so we're institutions that are made up of human beings. So don't let that stop you from trying new things, and reach out to me if I can be of any help. If you have follow-up questions or anything, I'm happy to assist with that. And I just thank you so much, Mina, and hope you continue to remain well and have a more calm fall than the last couple of weeks and months have been. And I wish that for everybody who listens to this recording as well.
Thank you, Margaret, so much. As I said before, thank you for accepting the invitation. It was an honor. I hope it will be seen by many, many people. I think it's very important. I think the topics you addressed are really sensitive and really significant. So thank you. For the last things I would like the people to invite you for our next session is going to take place on October 18th. We're going to talk with the director of the Holocaust Museum in Guatemala, which is kind of interesting. So you are very welcome. And I hope to see you again with the Explorers. Thank you very much.